Okay, let's call this meeting to order. The Economic Development Committee meeting at 1 p.m. Has been called to order, and I'm going to take roll call. Let's see. Brian Kinman. Here. Stuart Zimmerman. Online. Okay, I got you, Stuart. Saw the raised hand. Claire Halpern. Not present. Michael Wall.
Here.
Chris Fox.
Here.
Aaron Teitelbaum.
Here.
Mike Shadle here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 present. Non-voting. I'll just do it. All the Councilmember Patel.
Here, thanks.
Oh, great. Councilmember Mr. Fader. I believe he is, out of
Out of the
town.
country. Yeah.
Councilmember Hurst. Okay. Staff, Gary Carter, Myron, David, Mayor McAndrew. All right, we got plenty of people to move forward. Everyone was provided a copy of the minutes from the last meeting, January 15th. Do I have a motion to approve?
Also move.
There's a second?
Second.
All right, any additions or corrections? Great, thank you, staff. All those in favor of approval? I'll take that as aye. Those opposed? All right, minutes have been accepted. Okay, so today's key efforts is an overview of the city from staff. And I appreciate the fact that everyone has been jumping in with eager to come up with solutions and look at all different types of things. So I'll just ask everyone, let's take this day by day. We're meeting once a month right now. We're not going to solve everything initially. We have some directives from our city council, so I want to make sure that we're following those. And so today's focus will be staff and kind of giving an overview of where we are in terms of economic activity, procedures, and so on in the city of Clayton. And so that will be our focus. And then after they're finished, we'll talk a little bit about next steps. Everybody good with that? Great. So I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Carter, and we can hear what's going on in the city.
Great. Thank you, Mike. So at the last meeting, our initial meeting, we had a long conversation about what information we had available, what's been done in the past. I attempted to take all that information and put that into a share file that I've sent you the link to a couple of times. That's the complete information. So everything from real estate vacancy analysis to the 2040 plan to those actions taken by the Plan Commission and City Council on enactment of the 24 plan. Some examples of what other communities are doing economic development wise from across the country. And there's a couple other topics that we'll come across here. So this staff report is really just a high overview of all of those documents to hopefully bring us up to speed and see what else out there is that we might need. So I think there was a discussion at last month's meeting about what survey information we had, and actually included in the 2040 plan is the some of the survey information and the meeting notes from all the meetings, the public meetings that they took from that process. So these were kind of the repetitive or top themes from those meetings and surveys about diversification of revenue, creating retail vitality, support for small businesses, development of incentive policies, but that's kind of that has two components to it. There was a statement or a belief in developing incentive plans. I think tax increment financing was the one that was mentioned. That's probably because most people know that. I would take that more generically as just incentives in general. But there was also some recognition that we didn't want to subsidize high-rise projects either. And then key emphasis was mixed use development, making downtown and a place of where people live, work, and play, not necessarily office towers. And there's quite a few slides, so I'm going to move through this pretty fast. So if you have any questions or comments or contradictions to any of this, just let me know as we go through this. So
And for those of you online, don't hesitate to interrupt and I'll try to make sure we get you.
Can I just, you just made a statement that you referred to sort of live, work, walk downtown. And I think in our last meeting, we actually talked about the fact there are many areas in Clayton that we're looking at, not just downtown. So
that's correct.
I just
That's-
qualify that. Yeah.
Thank you, Brian. So moving into the 2040 land use plan, this is what the plan has us built out in the future. And it's kind of breaking down into different segments of the city. First one going through here is the Maryland Gateway. Just so you know, the purple color represents the potential mixed use areas. As you will recognize, many of these house current businesses or buildings themselves now. So just keeping in mind this is a plan for the future. A lot of the times it requires lot consolidation also. But in this particular area, they're treating this as a gateway into the city, a dense entrance into downtown Clayton. A lot of the plans will incorporate higher height on the downtown or business area and the lower step down as we go into the neighborhoods.
Gary, when you, if you don't mind, as you go through each of theirs, oh, sorry. That's my own fault. If you don't mind, when you go through each of theirs, could you just say, and you don't have to go into specifics, but is there a lot of activity in this area in terms of, economic development or homes being, just give us give us a flavor if this is an active area or this is an area that's stable or from that perspective.
Sure. So the purple area in here, starting from the left and going to the right around the curve, the Forsyth curve, obviously this biggest chunk here, as you're looking at your screen, you can see the mouse there. That is the brown shoe area here that Opera St. Louis has under contract for a portion of it. Claris is selling this piece along Gay separately, and there has been expressed interest in there. We have not received any formal plans as far as the city goes, but there is interest here. And then the parking lot of Claris also has interest too, but again, we haven't received formal application for those either. But to answer your question, Mike, I would consider this an immense area of interest currently. Now, that being said, Opera St. Louis has to raise the funds here for this project, but they're confident they will do so. Next area is Merrimack Gateway. This is the north side on Maryland here, primarily. Mostly residential, except for along the Maryland corridor. This is where Keeley Group is currently building apartments on North Merrimack. And there's a few office buildings on the west side of Merrimack that are in some stage of conceptual design for redevelopment, but nothing that has been submitted or even presented to the city at this point in time. And the central business district, obviously, is this area here. We at one time had several projects proposed at this time, such as the World Trade Center, the Sterling Bank site, and those. I think one thing that we do have going on currently right now is the former World Trade Center that the county used to own on Bonham. I don't know if you've paid attention to the council's agenda here recently. We have entered into a funding agreement with the developer to convert that project into apartments. Anticipate that moving forward through the council next month. It's a historic tax credit project, so the exterior of the building will not change. So that's what's going on in downtown. Forsyth Gateway, this is the Centene property, Ritz-Carlton, WashU, Famous Bar site. I think everyone recognizes that the Centene has this property right here in this area for sale currently. I'm unaware of any letters of interest or any takers at this point in time. And then I am unaware of any plans WashU has for the Famous Bar, and currently unaware of anything going on site also. But same principles, higher density here, lower density as we step down to the single families. Clayton Gateway down by the Galleria, really looking for the consolidation along Clayton Road here. But as of right now, this is just a future plan, unaware of any active development process going on down here.
Gary, for purposes of clarification on that last slide, maybe it's just my own edification, but the Famous Bar building, how much of that is in Clayton and how much of that is in U City?
The entire building is in Clayton.
Okay.
As you would be pulling in to go to the wine and cheese place, that on the right-hand side where the old Gold's Gym
Yes.
used to be, that is University City.
So the parking area is Clayton as well.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Most of the area is Clayton. Okay,
Got it.
yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. Hanley and Whitedown, really not a lot to develop in that area, except they're at the corner everyone's familiar with. Looking to bring mixed use in there. Matt with Louis and Wright's Tavern is doing a great job himself redeveloping that area there. So, but no other plans of consolidation at this time. High Point and Demond, the big property there would be this former CBC site owned by WashU at this time. But obviously no current plans at this point in time.
Also, what is it? What's the status of, is it Armbruster, the funeral home?
Yeah, it's
What's
been
the
up for
status
sale.
of that property? It's still just for sale, right?
Yeah, as far as I know, it's just for sale at this
Yeah.
time.
Thanks.
It has been for a few years too, so.
Yeah.
And then there's also the Commerce Bank former location on the corner there too. One of the topics that was requested to have information on, and again, there's more in that share file, so these are just the highlights, but on the city finances, fairly straightforward. This year's budget is forecasted at a deficit primarily because of the one-time cost associated with tornado recovery and continuing expenses for the livable and community master plan design services. We still maintain healthy reserves above our policy target. We have added some additional staff in this latest budget. Still maintaining nationally certified police and fire departments. A lot of the resource allocation is going to the build out of the 24 plan.
Gary, is there any, let's see, what do I would say? Any capital intensive projects that are ongoing right now or slated to be ongoing? I didn't look at your budget, but
Yeah,
Yes. Mayor, did you want to?
Yeah, I mean, we're currently renovating and gutting our municipal garage. So we bonded out $14 million. So if you look at our budget, at least, we just did a fourth quarter budget amendment this week at our council meeting. And so things look great, but a lot of that is related to the money that we received, and then we'll spend that down in the next year as we finish that project. So that's a huge capital project that we're working on.
Will say, as far as just capital expenditures go, outside of the project the mayor just mentioned that we issued the bonds for over at the municipal maintenance facility, that and then the Shaw Park project that's being designed right now. Aside from those two, if we were to build that Shaw Park project, essentially everything within the capital fund at this point is just maintaining infrastructure that we already have. So if you look at it, it really breaks down into road resurfacings, redoing lighting within our parks, redoing street lighting, redoing park shelters, those types of things. So we're really not building new infrastructure here or don't have anything really on the horizon outside of, again, the municipal maintenance facility and then potentially Shaw Park. But it is tight just to get all of the
Maintenance.
existing capital maintained.
thank you. Any, let's just take a break there. Any questions right now from folks? I know we're kind of moving along quickly, but again, the intent here was to give us kind of a general idea of activities within the city from an economic development nature, but also understand just some of the challenges the city may have on a very macro basis here. So keep going, Gary.
So we are expecting an increase in property tax, and additional sales tax this year, as we start to recover from the pandemic years. We are forecasting structural deficits as we move forward. We'll come to the point in the future, but we are limited on how we grow property taxes in the state of Missouri. And those structural deficits leads into the reserve outlook where it will be necessary to draw those down as we go out to further years without any changes, whether it be expenses or additional revenue through new development.
One other thing I'll point out, just as far as dealing with this issue, Gary's absolutely right. There is a structural issue here where last year we just closed out fiscal year 25 with doing our audit and everything else. Sales tax was up 1.5%. Utility tax was up about 2%. When you look at the property taxes, those were up about 1.5%. But when you look at our expense growth, that's probably in like the 5% range. So the revenue increases that we're seeing just simply aren't keeping pace with the increases we're seeing on the expenditure side. So that's the structural issue that we're dealing with. The council recently put together a citizen finance committee, and they're going to have their first meeting tomorrow morning. And really, it's just a group of citizens with some expertise in this area to lend their knowledge as well and help devise these long-term strategies for really trying to fix that structural issue that we have. So I just wanted to point out that there's this other committee that's kind of working in tandem with the newly formed Economic Development Committee with special business and really trying to align all of these groups so that we can move forward and hopefully take care of this without large property tax increases over time.
David, I don't put you on the spot on this one because this wasn't, I don't think it was on our list here, but could you just explain for everyone so everyone has a good understanding? And I don't know if the sharing has changed, or the amount that we share on sales tax, but could you just outline the various sales taxes that we get? Can you?
Sure.
Thank you.
Yes.
And an estimate on the sharing.
I don't have
But that's fine.
Maybe an
that's fine.
estimate would be difficult.
But just,
yeah, as far as the way the money comes in when you're looking at sales tax, we do have local sales tax that we collect. So voters authorize what's called a local option. So it's a 1 cent tax that's out there. We have a lot of specialty taxes. So if you look at what was approved last October, we had a new fire sales tax increase that was approved. So we went up from a quarter cent to a half cent. That money collected, though, can only be used for fire service. And so that generates just under $2 million a year. And fire department costs a whole lot more than that. So other sources are kind of filling that gap. But we do have a dedicated fire sales tax. We have a dedicated capital tax. That's a half cent tax, and that goes to those capital expenditures, can only be used for capital expenditures. So redoing streets, buying equipment, fixing up buildings. And you can use some of that for some staff time that's utilized, for instance, engineers that might be working on those capital projects, but it's a dedicated tax. We have a parks and stormwater tax that we collect here. That all goes to parks. So essentially we're paying down debt, money we borrowed to redo the center of Clayton. So almost all of that parks revenue, dedicated parks revenue is tied up in debt service currently, and probably will be forever, because as soon as the bonds are paid off that were issued to make those improvements at the center of Clayton, will be due to make new improvements again. So that tax is really locked up with that. So we do have a variety of sales taxes that come in, but aside from just kind of your local option tax and then some Prop P money that we get from the county and some other shared revenue through the county, these are really dedicated to very specific purposes. So for us, it's really important to be strong on the property tax side, because that money can be used for essentially anything. Traditionally, we've used all of it for operating. We tend not to try to commingle capital dollars and operating dollars. But about 25% of our budget is property tax. About 25% of our revenue is sales tax, and the rest breaks down with utility tax receipts and other things. Does that help as an overview?
Thank you. I thought that was important. Do we have a question? Yes? Come up.
Yeah,
Just
people
so
listen.
everyone, there, we got people on video today.
Would you also state your name, Jeff? Turn the mic, the button green. There you go.
Yeah, there we go. Jeff Leonard, resident. David, how will the funds be handled when it's time to do the Y down redo and the lampposts and all the capital outlay that will have to happen for that? Will that be bonded, or how will that be handled?
So what we're doing is we're using our general fund reserves, so our fund balance that we have, and we're basically forward funding that work, and then we'll get reimbursements for portions of it through FEMA. So eligible expenses will be things like streetlights, irrigation, any type of work related to curbs. We can recover that cost at 85% from FEMA and SEMA, which is the State Emergency Management Agency. We are on the hook for anything like landscaping, trees that we replant. They don't reimburse any of that, so that's going to come out of pocket. But all of this is coming out of the general fund reserves. The nice thing is we've already had funds obligated for our protective measures. So this was the immediate storm response, all the police overtime. And we're also going to get 85% of our debris removal costs back. So that alone, just those two things, you're looking at about $2.1 million that's being reimbursed, covered at 85%. So the quicker we can get these things processed through FEMA, get that money back into our reserves, the better off we're going to be. That 61% number that Gary was showing on the fund balance, that's as if FEMA isn't going to reimburse anything at all. We do anticipate that should we get 85% of all of our eligible expenses back, our fund balance, which is the percentage of your annual operating expenditures that you have in the bank, should rise from that 61% number back up to around 75% or so. But we have enough cash within the fund balance to float that sort of thing. And really, in the end, that's why we're a AAA credit rated city, because we have the ability to take a hit like a tornado and not have it impact operating or our ability to pay our debts. So
Thank you. I wish Claire was here.
Long answer for all that,
I
but,
wish Claire
yeah.
was here to hear you say that. She would be very excited.
May I ask a clarifying question?
Sure.
David?
Of course.
Yeah, I just want to make sure I'm understanding, because you made a comment about the sales tax that the way I interpreted threw me off a little bit. You were saying that in terms of our ability to fund general things that we need, we have to look to real estate taxes. And, I think part of the reason at least I thought the reason this committee was here and going toward vibrancy is to create more opportunities for sales tax. So I just want to make sure I'm not misinterpreting what you just said.
I think possibly are. Maybe I misstated that a little bit. What I was getting at is the flexibility we have with the property tax revenue that we receive versus the sales tax revenue, because a large portion of the sales tax revenue that comes in is dedicated to things that are outside of operating. But I absolutely agree, we need to do more to increase our overall general revenue that's coming in through sales tax.
I mean, there's still, yes, the sales tax is collected generally and we get some.
Right.
I think, yeah, David, I think David's making the nuanced difference between the general sales tax and those dedicated like capital and
I completely
fire.
understand it. I just want to make sure we got
Yes.
that clarification.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
All right.
Yeah, and I would
Does
say,
that help?
I mean,
Yep.
my purpose was mostly just so people understand, in terms of economic development, what does economic development create? It creates a myriad of different revenue sources. And I don't think we are taxed with saying we're going to specifically focus on sales tax. I mean, one of them talks about revenue diversification. One of the unique things about Clayton for a long time is the fact that its buckets of revenue are from various places. Cities like Webster and Kirkwood and some of the other cities where sales tax is shared more dramatically. They are not a point of sales city. They rely heavily on property taxes. So the fact that we have different buckets, I think our focus is trying to enhance those buckets across all paths. So I don't want to get into we're only focused on sales tax. I think it's just important for where the city gets its revenues and how they are applied, so that we understand when we talk about different things, how that's impacted. So, all right, Gary, let's keep moving.
Yeah, so just
Can I
going
ask
over,
one more?
Oh, I'm sorry, the question.
Yeah, you didn't mention the Opera Theater coming into Clayton. I know they're all excited about what they're doing. Is that on the radar any place? And for economic development, can we kind of build around it? And my second question, my only other question is, you haven't mentioned parking revenue. So, Michael gave us something on parking. Is parking revenue a substantial part of the city revenue? Those are my
2.5.
questions.
2.5, 2.4.
Fines are 2% in that range. I think parking itself is probably, I don't know, maybe 6% or so. I can't remember exactly how it breaks down. I wouldn't call it a significant portion of our overall revenue. I know Gary's going to get into the parking revenue here in just a moment. The first question you had, though, was about Opera Theater and what that does from an economic development standpoint. The Opera Theater in and of itself doesn't really help anything because it's a nonprofit organization. So they're not going to pay property tax. There's no sales tax levied for anything that's sold on that site either. However, it is an activity generator. So it's, how do you leverage them coming here and use that to potentially be a catalyst for other things happening in that immediate area on Maryland? But Opera Theater by itself isn't going to provide, I don't think, a massive benefit. Even from the restaurant standpoint, people that go to Opera Theater, if you've been before, there's an outdoor picnic dinner kind of thing that happens when Opera Theater is performing, and most of the people that are going are going to eat at Opera Theater. So I think maybe the other groups that are using it 9 months out of the year might generate some restaurant traffic, but overall, not a huge economic driver for us.
Thank you, David. Gary?
Yeah, so I'll try to pick this up a little bit. Sales tax is expected to grow, as David mentioned, primarily because of the new fire and EMS sales tax and the addition of the marijuana sales tax. We currently have one dispensary in town. Property taxes are stable and growing. As I alluded to a little while ago, the Hancock Amendment really limits our growth to CPI or 5%, the lesser of it. And so really the only time we grow property taxes is with new development. And combining that, hopefully new development that also generates sales tax. Thus the emphasis on mixed use projects. Utility tax is increasing as office occupancy increases. More heat, more lights for those that are actually in the building. And the revenue is expected from parking expected to decline. We attribute that to the hybrid work models But we also have the pending lease with the new development at World Trade Center for our bottom parking garage that the city owns. So that will be some additional revenue.
Gary or David, in terms of those three, property tax, utility tax, and sales tax, how does Clayton compare? I haven't seen a survey in a while. How does Clayton compare to other municipalities in and around St. Louis County with regards to those rates? Are we higher? Are we lower? Or are we pretty much average?
We're pretty much average. So
Yeah.
I would say cities with fire departments in particular, you're going to see higher levies because it's an expensive.
Nothing about the city is average, David.
So you typically see though that those cities are going to run a little bit higher as far as the tax levies are concerned because you're going to have like a dedicated fire sales tax. For cities with municipal fire departments, I would say we're right in line with everybody else, which is essentially pretty close to maxed out on all the available sales tax levies that are out there. The only one that we really don't have is the economic development sales tax. That was before voters maybe 10 years ago or less and failed. So that's the only one that's really available. Outside of that, from a property tax standpoint, we're actually middle of the pack, maybe at this point starting to go towards the lower side. We haven't had a general property tax increase here in the city in about 30 years. So the last time we did have one, the city was up closer to like 95% or so. And because, like Gary mentioned, as property taxes have gone up, we've had to roll the rate down to comply with the Hancock Amendment. That property tax levy of like 95 cents is eroded down to just over 50 cents. And that's going to continue to happen over time. So
Thank you.
hopefully that helps.
Any questions?
I would just follow up with that, Mike, that, unlike some other communities too, our CIDs and TDDs, which are our additional tax, are very site specific, and we don't have a broad general area affecting our total sales tax.
I know this may be difficult to answer, but have we ever done an assessment of the potential sales tax opportunity that we have that we're currently not meeting? So if we had 50% of all retail square footage filled, how much more revenue would that throw off from a sales tax perspective? Or it's 60% or 80%. I know that's super hypothetical, but it would give us a sense of how much sales tax we're kind of leaving on the table by having empty retail.
It's not something we've calculated. As you said, it would be kind of difficult to dial in, but it's not a study that we performed. I mean, if one of those was an Apple store, the numbers are ridiculously high, or high-end jeweler, that sort of thing. They tend to
It's user
an
dependent.
ice cream shop. So trying to come up with an average is tough. I mean, it's something we could try to do, but I'm not sure how close it would be. But it's not an exercise we've undertaken.
Just real quickly, moving on, if we're ready, Mike.
Yes.
The forecasting in the budget is conservative without extremely high growth rates. I think that's probably potentially something that the finance committee starting tomorrow may or may not look at. Personnel cost, as David alluded to earlier, is one of our costs that grows faster than our revenue stream. And then we have talked about the capital improvement prioritization. And again, our strategic directives are, executing the comprehensive plan. Again, one of the topics we discussed last time in the meeting was how are our properties doing? We have some area experts in the crowd too, so they can jump in if they like. But this information was taken from a database last month, so it's fairly recent. As you can see, our inventory recently jumped with the production of the Coleman Building and the Commerce Building Yes, Forsyth Point. Thank you. It goes through several iterations, so I usually get one of the iterations stuck in my head. The vacancy rates are coming back down, although there was a little bit of a pop there here recently. net absorption, basically what's coming online and how it's being taken down as far as leases goes. We are maintaining about a 12.7% vacancy rate. While it's still an increase from our past average, we are outperforming much of the rest of the nation. Rents are continuing to grow, probably not as fast as property owners would like. And really, we don't have any office markets or office product, at least that I'm aware of, currently in the pipeline. So what we have is what we're going to have for a little bit.
I'll put Mr. Fox on. Any comments, Mr. Fox, on the current state of office market in Clayton?
I guess my only comment would be it's really hard to look at office on the average. Really, it's asset dependent. If you were to look at the nicest, I say nicest, newest, most amenitized, improved buildings today, you're probably talking about 6 or 7 buildings. And that doesn't mean they're all new, as I said. I mean, some of those buildings are 20 years old, but they've been invested in pretty significantly. So they do meet what would be a corporate occupancy standard of today. That asset class totals, well, let's say round numbers, 2.6 million square feet, 3 million square feet. The vacancy rate is 3.5% and going down. You needed 50,000 square feet of office space in Clayton today, contiguous. You have one option, and the lease rate's $45 a foot, and it may be leased already. So those are the haves. The have-nots struggle. So you get to 12% because you've got what would be more the A minus, the B class market that is going to struggle. And so you see occupiers forced to maybe look at a different submarket to find a more amenitized, improved office asset versus whether they would live with less just to be in Clayton. And some do. I think, the B class building here is going to do a lot better than the B class building elsewhere. If you needed 10,000 square feet of space in Clayton, you're going to have a lot of options. The average lease rate's $6 or $7 higher a square foot than it is on the 40 corridor. And that's all submarket driven. Buildings aren't all that different. People just pay a premium to be central. So I think the outlook today is probably rosier than those numbers indicate if you just look at it asset by asset. And the inventory is the struggle. The average age of the office building in Clayton dates to the early 90s. And that's despite the fact that most of the new multi-tenant development has happened here over the last 20 years. But it's about if you think about it, maybe 7 buildings in the last 20 plus years. It's not like we are oversupplied. So if Clayton could deliver a new office project of scale about every 3 or 4 years, you'd be doing great.
I mean, so you would say that there's definite opportunity in the redevelopment of B and
If
C.
you had another Forsyth Point, you'd fill it up tomorrow. It's just going to take you 3 years to get it. So to determine what the office market will look like in 3 years is very difficult. I mean, there was a sea change in mentality at the corporate occupier level that chose Clayton, which saw the, Energizer. Claris didn't move, but they made every effort to stay. There were a lot of people trying to pull them out of Clayton, and they had no interest in going. But if you look at what Emerson has done, it's really a new day for the corporate occupier to choose a lease and choose it in Clayton. Was pretty dynamic, and that was a COVID shift. So it almost felt like it happened overnight. So that'll be the hard part. And to develop an office project in Clayton is very hard, just in terms of how you handle the parking and subsurface development, all those kinds of things, and the timing. The demand is what's so hard to pin down. But right now, those premium assets, and that's not unique, that's universal, almost in every geography. That A-class, A-plus class buildings are hitting occupancy levels that have been unseen.
Flight to quality is the name of the game right now. Everyone's moving to quality buildings. as they're amenitized, they look good. They're efficient. That's where people are moving to.
And that's solely to, they're making a bid back to get everybody back into the office. So the thing Clayton can do is provide an environment outside of the buildings that's as nice as inside. And that's hard. That's why our city struggles, because the environment outside is not as nice as it is inside. So if you spend a fortune on your building and you're in the CBD, you still have some systemic challenges you have to deal with. And Clayton doesn't have those issues, which is why they've attracted the kind of occupancy they have. The real question is going to be, how does that translate into overall more dynamic growth elsewhere that supports retail and restaurants, density, street life, multifamily? The office occupancy is great. So it's a matter of turning that into other revenue sources.
Well, and
But
I think the amenitized, I mean, part of that's kind of part of the problem. Like my son, as part of his Catalyst business program, they went to go visit NISA in the Centene Tower. And he was like, yeah, Mom, they get free breakfast and lunch every single day. And I was like, well, Jack, that really sucks. And he was like, why, Mom? Isn't that great? And I was like, yeah, except for the fact that it'd be nice if just one day a week they told their employees to leave their very nice building and go outside and have lunch in Clayton, or
Fresh.
breakfast or something, but these buildings have become so highly amenitized, as you say, that nobody wants to leave.
And those are the occupied, that's not the building doing that. That's the occupier doing that.
Right.
They didn't ask the building. So
Yeah.
a lot of times occupiers are doing that. And if they don't want to go there, then they could go to the buildings.
Right.
Amenitized, hot food, fresh. And if they don't want to do that, then they might go outside. Choice.
Excellent. Thanks, Chris. I didn't mean to put you on the spot, but I thought that was helpful since
Like the thought,
that's
man.
pretty relevant. Yeah. Gary.
Yeah, so next market we're going to look at is the multifamily. So, we've had a recent injection of supply. It looks like we're going to have more supply here come online with the project that we mentioned on North Merrimack. And then potentially, if the comes to fruition, the World Trade Center. So we will have probably 400 roughly, plus or minus, new units coming online. And that's what this graph is depicting. As things come online, it takes a while to ramp up. So that's impacting rents. But as far as I know, we have one of the healthier rent markets for multifamily in the St. Louis region. And I think that's why more people want to develop apartments here. And something I want to address here real quickly is that, I don't think we have enough yet to drive that vibrancy on the streets. We do have a lot of apartments, but I think we need more to sustain the retail, because the retail's falling the rooftops, whether it's a single family home or an apartment ceiling. So just side. Again,
Gary, just on that, I'm sorry, Bob. We don't have to look at it today, but do you know if most of these where the occupancy is on those?
yes,
On that?
yeah, it's on this next chart. here.
Okay, sorry.
There
we go.
Yeah, so, it's, as Chris alluded to, just like with the commercial property, it's property by property, but, the Clayton on the Park, the 212 are fairly leased up. The Bemiston Place across the street is ramping up. It's relatively new product, so it's going to take them a while longer, but Ceylon across the street from there on Central is fairly leased up too, so you can see our vacancy is come down considerably as primarily as Bemiston Place has leased up. Again, we've had significant development here. Rents are kind of fluctuating as occupancy sorts itself out. And we have several more projects coming online. This is just kind of a snapshot of what's going downtown. The database I use isn't really great for retail in such a small market, so this is kind of a personal inventory that I maintain here. So we got about 43,000 square feet. Who takes it and how much sales tax they generate is yet to be determined, but these are the kind of where it's at. We did develop that new storefront window covering, so it's fairly easy to identify, maybe a unintended consequence of that program, but it is standardized now. So, but you can see where our vacancies are at. Hotel market, our hotels are great. I mean, that's the simple analysis of this data. Occupancy is very healthy. The average daily rate per the room is healthy, and the revenue that they get from each room is healthy also. Our hotels are outperforming the market. There's significant pricing power. And I think we are running the flagships as far as the hotel choices go in the same. So these are, I think it may have been Brian or Councilman Fader that asked for, what are other communities doing? This again, like all the other data we're presenting, is in more detail on the share file. So you can go in and look at it. And I will also place this PowerPoint there too for everyone to go back to and reference. But, it's kind of based on what's going on in their market. Coral Gables in Florida is ramping up tech skills. Evanston has a program to help Main Street businesses, retailers, restaurants with storefronts. Webster Groves has a program through their business district. Evanston also has, through Northwestern, consulting for small businesses, which is kind of interesting. Birmingham does events and promotion. One of these in here is offering access to information, which is a key component. Michael, I don't know, want to talk about that at all or not? No, well, I was talking about the entrepreneurial help that
The mic wasn't on.
doing, and then they're also running access to database for information purposes too.
Yeah, in terms of like just getting like student support, is that, yeah, so there's a lot of opportunity there. In fact, I am launching a new course in the fall, which is a real estate course. Imagine we'd have a group of students working, let's say, with our local leaders here for an entire semester to develop strategies. There are other courses I do that are just full semester where a student team would work as a consultant group to kind of tackle specific challenges. So we've done a lot. So I'm presenting to the Regional Business Council next month at their board meeting to share our findings from a project. We've done work with Stewart in the past and helped even work with our local small business group. So I would say that free access to really smart students is not in short supply. So I think there are a lot of ways that we could activate specific initiatives to say, okay, let's have one student team tackle this problem, another student team tackle that problem. And we can look at it through different lenses. So I can bring in real estate specific students who want to be in real estate. I can bring in marketing students who care more about the marketing and sales side. So I would think it'd just be up to us to consider what kind of problems we want them to solve and what kind of solutions they want us to, we want them to develop. But yes, that is available. And I've already talked to our dean about it, and our students are very excited as well.
Thank you. So try to keep this moving so we get everybody out of here on time. Some, one of the questions was, what do we do? Have we done? We conduct business visits and interviews. I mean, that's from me to the mayor, to David, um, talking to realtors, developers, retailers. We've done such things in the past as we owned a majority of the site where the Emerson Tower and Commerce Tower sit today. We issued that RFP for that development. The AC Hotel was come about because of an RFP the city did for the old police station that sat there. We had issued another one at Hanley and Wydown for that parking lot. Unfortunately, it never came to fruition. We have offered discounted validated parking for restaurants and retailers. We have done discounted monthly parking for retail and restaurant employees. We conduct special events to draw attention to downtown, such as the Music and Wine, Jazz Festival. Some of the former events were a farmer's market. We created a parklet and parklet regulations. We do marketing on Instagram, Facebook. Back in the day, we used to do it in Ladue News and Post Dispatch. We came up with a retail and incentive policy, which helped restore older buildings. This really came out of when Jennifer's Pharmacy, if you remember where that was on North Central, we had a restaurateur looking at that, but the infrastructure on the floor wasn't quite right. So we came up with a program. Unfortunately, it was never utilized. So it may not, could have used some more tweaks. Some of the concepts we've researched and presented to past boards over the time include land banks, incubators, revolving loan funds, and retail rent subsidies. Realize we're running out of time, but just real quickly, one of the questions was what has been implemented on the plans and zoning side of things since the adoption of 2040. We have rewritten the zoning code for downtown, emphasizing mixed use development, concentrating on entertainment venues. We have removed the prohibition against bars. So substantially taking out the food requirement. So people can have just bars, allowing alcohol as an accessory use. We have recently introduced legislation to allow short-term rentals with several conditions, as you can see there. We've had some property owners expressed interest in converting older office or two-story retail buildings into that could be Airbnb or VRBO for that matter. Again, this is referencing the conversion of the downtown to a mixed use type situation. With that came the consumer emphasis area. So where in the past, everything was required to have retail regardless of location, it kind of really puts the emphasis in these areas here. So that solid dark line is the primary area and those dashed lines are the secondary areas that if you were to propose new development on there, basically there would come a requirement to have some kind of consumer walk-up experience on the first floor. And that was really fast, but that's.
Okay, so thank you, Gary. I made a commitment to keep these within an hour. So again, the goal today was to give a very quick general overview of what's happening in the city. And Gary and David, thank you very much. That was extremely helpful. And to the committee members, if there's anything additional or something specific, let's send your questions offline, and we can have some follow-up from Gary and David on those things. Our next step here is about our next steps and kind of our direction from the city council. Can you go to the first slide you had up there? Keep going. It was Yeah, there you go. No, that's good. So, it's challenging. We have an economic policy and we have some guidelines that came out of the 2040 process, goals, as they say, general policies. And you all have in front of you, it's probably, I don't know, 15 or so items on here. It's challenging, and I know everyone would like to get into certain topics or maybe their personal concerns and so on. I think for the success of this committee, we as a committee will need to pick a few in order to really focus on as we move forward and try to address those items. And I know that will be a challenge, but the city has given us kind of a directive here to kind of take what they've done out of the work from the 2040 process and then into this economic development policy, and then they provided these different action items. And so we as a committee need to take a look at these, and I would suggest that we pick several, and those are the ones we're going to focus on and try to come up with actions. Sure, as we go through this process, we may find that maybe something we work on doesn't make sense, or maybe it bleeds into another element. I'm sure that's quite fine, but I think it's important for the sake of time to try to tackle everything at once. I think will be a significant challenge. So that's our homework for our next meeting, is to take a look at this sheet, and then as a group we come up and we choose several that we want to attack. Gary, any other thoughts? Are you okay with that approach?
Yeah, that's great.
David? Mayor? Okay. So I guess real quick, thoughts or comments from the presentation today and our next action items from anyone? Michael did a great job of sending out some summarized information, which I think is extremely helpful to us as we take a look. This is a vibrant, diverse community with regards to economic development, as we found out from our various revenue sources and the various activities. There's been no lack of effort by this city over the last 40 years for doing things to try to enhance economic development, despite the fact that it's still a very attractive community. The fact that the city has to take action to do something is always challenging, because we all think that Clayton is well, of course, it's number one on the list. So any other comments?
I do, Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
In terms of next steps, this list, it just seems like this list is striking me as diving down a level before we're ready to dive down a level. And my point would be, I think there's some things that we really ought to be talking about, some of the materials that were sent out, the different cities and what they had done and so on and so forth. And the thing that struck me when I read through that is that each of those cities had a different starting point. Some of them already had a reason to draw people to the city, so they were building out around an already, a place where their people are drawn to. Other cities were trying to build something that was going to draw people to the city, small businesses, whatever it may be. And I think when I look at this list and I think about where we are in Clayton, and I think there's different definitions of the area, even in the central business district, if you will, or at least the nearby side of that thing, of that element, it just seems like that's a little different. And even the definition of vibrancy, I think we ought to be talking a little bit about, because I think it can vary whether we're talking about, down on Forsyth or the central business district, DeMond, wherever we're talking about it, it could be a little bit different. I mean, I look at vibrancy down in Carondelet Plaza versus vibrancy around Napoli. They're two different vibrancies from my perspective. And it just seems like we could use a little time to structure that, think about that, pull that apart, and then we can dive into these categories. And we might find that looking at one category here is going to be defined differently depending upon where we're talking about. And there may be an action that we're going to want to look at to draw people in. We've got people who live in apartments. Gary's made the point we need more apartments. We've got people that are here in businesses. You made the point nobody goes out from the businesses. They're all staying in the businesses. what are we going to do to draw people in and make this a place people are going to want to come? And depending upon the time of day, it's going to be different groups of people and different draws. And I think we need to spend some time talking about that before we dive into that level of details, my suggestion.
Okay, other thoughts? Yes?
One thing I wanted to share how I'm going to think about this, and I love the fact you bring up prioritization. I do think that maybe perhaps these are interconnected as opposed to individual things. And so perhaps we can think about developing a flywheel where we might think about maybe solving the 2 or 3 most important things, and then kind of work to determine how that might create a flywheel effect that will be connected to these different points. Because even though I see perhaps 15 points, maybe there's really only 3. And really, they're all interconnected. So maybe we can all just think about that together, because I think this might actually be a much simpler problem. But these are all interconnected components of what success looks like. So just wanted to share how I'm going to try and grapple with that in the next month, and perhaps it might help others as they do the same.
Good, good. Comments from those online?
I just thought it was a really, it gave a lot of insight on what has been done and what is going on and where possibilities for funding is and isn't. And that is good for, smaller retailers like myself to know what's going on so that we have a good understanding of what's available. And I also really appreciate the idea of what other communities in town are doing. Because that's the kind of stuff that I have seen successful in creating a vibrant area, is really supporting those retail locations to create that at nighttime. The daytime stuff, we are kind of fighting an uphill battle with all of these A-class buildings, as you mentioned. And, that's going to be a pretty difficult one to fight because they're already in place, in my opinion.
Thanks, Aaron. Stuart, looks like, were you raising your hand?
Yeah, my thought that I think I mentioned before was I think we ought to take a look at a broader perspective. So not just Clayton, but the area. I think this is a terrific area, and Clayton's right in the middle of it. So if we tried to draw people to the area, got cooperation from Washington University, which I know we can. We've even got Mike here helping us, and try to draw in some universities, U City, Ladue, Richmond Heights, the areas around us, and make this an attractive area. Because we are the center of county government, and there's really not a whole lot of towns like us in the country. I've seen some survey, it's probably 10 years old, but what are the great cities in the country? And Clayton always showed up amongst it. So there was Clayton, there's Beverly Hills, there's Bloomfield Hills, Michigan. So I think we could promote the whole area, and Clayton being at the center of the area, and get those others to participate with us, so we don't do it alone. And I think we could promote the whole area, which gets everybody to the area, and of course they get it to the middle. Then the other thing I would say is we also have a bunch of Fortune 500 companies in Clayton. We have medium-sized businesses. For instance, the two that I was involved in, Reuben Brown is a CPA firm, and now they're the 38th largest CPA firm in the country, based in Clayton, Missouri. And then I helped for Buckingham Asset Management, which is just changed its name to Focus Financial, and it's the 8th largest registered investment advisory company in the country, and it's based in Clayton, Missouri. So I bet there are many other middle-sized companies that are of a similar nature. I can't have the only two. So I think we should promote the whole area and get everybody to help us. So we don't have to do it alone. And stop fragmenting. You know, we can do a good job, but I think together we could do even a bigger job. So
Okay.
I think that's my idea.
Okay. Thanks, Stuart. Any final comments? Mr. Fox, you have anything? Thank you.
No.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah, any comments? Okay. Mayor? Okay, so, good comments. Again, the challenge, there's a lot of stuff here and a lot of, people are coming from a lot of different perspectives, which is good and also a challenge. So, we're gonna give some thought here over the next month. We're gonna talk with staff and the mayor will try to put some stuff together in preparation for the next meeting. But I want you to think about these directives. These I recognize that these have a lot of linkages and so on, but this is kind of our directive from the council. So I want to make sure we're recognizing what we're supposed to do. So we can start with these. And Brian, I think you're right. The definitions in the eye of the beholder sometimes as to what vibrancy and those types of things are. So maybe that's also part of our task. So our next meeting, we had suggested that we meet on the fourth Thursday at 3 p.m. Of each month for the time being. Is everybody okay with that? I see a lot of nod headings. That's good. Put that in the record, nod heading. All right, so the fourth Thursday of every month at 3 p.m. Until we change that. Staff, you okay with that?
Yeah,
Mayor?
and
Okay.
Zoom will always be an option.
Zoom will always be an option. Okay. Any
Thanks.
final comments? We have a public comment section. No. All right. I appreciate everyone's time. I'm sorry I'm 7 minutes late, but thank you and have a fantastic day.
Thanks, everybody.